All right, it's time to get going. Good morning, everybody. You are listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and we'll be here for the next hour, again, bringing you up to date of what is going on that will immediately involve your country, your president, your government, and your future for 2026 as we move into the 250th anniversary of this country. My oldest daughter, Ashley, Dr. Ashley, was born in '76 on the 200th birthday of this country. So I guess she's going to be 50 this year. All right, and to those of you on the stream, welcome. Glad to have you as a part of this morning's program. Apparently, I was playing there ahead of time. I just tuned in, a pre-recorded show. Again, I want to mention that 2-for-1, the work that I do in the clinic, taking care of two people for the price of one, even if you have to come separate, that's fine. I think 2 or 3 people were scheduled yesterday for the month of January. It's just the scheduling needs to be done by the end of this month, which is today and tomorrow. And then if I don't see us till sometime in January, that's just fine. You call 801-523-1890 on tomorrow's health program. I'll get into more detail as to why that might be advantageous for you. It's just so fun taking care of this lady yesterday, first time. Just terrible neck pain. And the pain that would radiate down her neck, into her shoulder, into her arm. And no matter what position she's in, no matter how she moves, restricted range of the motion of the head turning right or left on top of her neck. Took some films, had a pretty big misalignment, worked on her. Immediately, she had full range of motion restored and considerable decrease in the pain that was going into her shoulder from her neck. So easy to fix this stuff. But they wanted to put her on medication. They wanted to put her into physical therapy that will not address the problem, just addresses the symptoms. All right, so I want to get into a continuing update that I did yesterday. That I also want to get into a couple of other things that I thought was very interesting going through the news, not the least of which is the one excavator working in the Gaza trying to clean up these smashed buildings and the thousands of bodies amidst the sea of rubble in an effort to try to retrieve and bury the dead. I think you need to hear that. And then also a little vaccine update. I was going to do this tomorrow, but I don't want to wait. The World Health Organization has instructed governments to start tracking online anti-vaccine messaging in real time with artificial intelligence, journaling vaccines, and those who online make comments relative to what would be considered anti-vax. Now, has our government started to do that? I think they probably already have. It's just anytime some big announcement comes out like this, I think you can usually rest assured it's already underway. It's not like somebody just finally decided, oh, let's get artificial intelligence to track the scammers out there. I'll talk more about that in greater detail tomorrow, but I want to, if there's time before the end of the program today, I want to bring it up because if you blog, if you write, if you email, and you say anything that might question the validity of the theory regarding vaccines, you might end up on an artificial intelligence list. Now, for those of you who've been listening to K-Talk long enough, you're already on 50 different lists, and you know that. So what's one more? So the world is hanging right now between hope and disaster as we finish 2025, move into 2026. where the decision has not been made, I believe, but it's very clear that the overall strategic crisis that is going on in Ukraine and in Gaza and in Taiwan is going to be the dominant features of 2026. And no matter what happens now in the next period around the Ukraine, there were these meetings I talked about yesterday between Zelensky and Trump. And then there was this phone call between Trump and Putin before that. And it seems actually that some moderate progress may have been made, because it was not only articulated by Trump, but Moscow made some comments. And when Moscow says they believe the end of the conflict is approaching, at Peskov, when Peskov made this announcement and saying that President Trump is correct in to say that the Ukraine peace talks are now in their final phase. Now, if the Russian spokesperson says this, then there might be some substance to it. We also know that shortly before this meeting, Trump had met in camouflage, I don't know what else to call it, with his military leadership, and stated that in no uncertain terms that if there's no diplomatic compromise possible, then the result is going to have to be accomplished by military means on the battlefield. But it seems that there is some progress in the negotiations, because when the Russians kind of back up what Trump is saying, then there may well be something to it. Trump said the deal was 95% ready. He didn't like to measure progress in percentages, he said, but he said, and this is his quote, "We're doing very well. We could be very close." Then Peskov said that Trump had yet to brief Putin on all the details after the meeting with Zelensky. This may already have happened by now. I don't know, but basically he reiterated Moscow's reluctance to make public comments about the specifics concerning the American mediation, except for what Peskov said. So this is potentially promising. It's not the end of the story by any means, but a promising step in the right direction, and one I think should just be a little bit mindful of the fact that the Myretverets, that group that put together the hit list of people that need to be killed, and there are many people you know of who are on that list that have said positive things about Russia, has labeled Trump now as an international war criminal. So that remains. But in other words, I'm just saying we must absolutely not assume that this thing is already settled. But because unless it's really settled, and of course it's not, but it's looking promising. And French President Macron has called for a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in early January to discuss the concrete measures of the alleged European security guarantees for the Ukraine, including stationing European Union peacekeepers in the Ukraine, which, of course, is completely 100% unacceptable to the Russians, because some of these countries are war parties. They're NATO countries. And therefore, this is just complete illusionary nonsense. But that's how Macron has acted over the last several years anyway, in an illusion. So while this is hopeful, we got to wait for the details in the next hours, days. But it doesn't mean that the alarm has gone down, not for one iota, because the overall strategic crisis still remains. And I think this is no more clear than the escalation that's going on around Taiwan, where following the U.S. approval for the largest ever weapons package of advanced weapons to Taipei, China, the Chinese military now has launched drills around Taiwan. Taiwan is being circled by the Chinese Navy. And they are using large-scale live fire military drills yesterday, deploying warships, deploying fighter jets, artillery in a multi-day operation called Joint World 2025A, conducted by the People's Liberation Army, and they simulate a blockade of key ports, precision strikes on maritime targets, and scenarios to counter the external interference, according to the Chinese Defense Ministry. Just imagine that. Imagine that you are a citizen of Taiwan, Taipei being the capital, has just received the largest ever weapons package delivered by the United States that it's ever received. Missiles, tanks, anti-tank artillery, anti-missile, anti-aircraft artillery, guns, bullets, all kinds of stuff, where out of one side of the mouth we believe in a one China policy, out the other side of our mouth it looks like we're trying to push China to war. Now, while China has been involved in wars, China never started one. China never attacked anybody, even when they should have attacked the Japanese early after the Boxer Rebellion. That's just my opinion. And so now, as of yesterday, with the announcement, the approval, the congressional approval of this weapons package to Taiwan, or I guess I should say the government in Taipei, live fire military drills by China are going on off the coast of Taipei, as well as the entire island, as the Chinese Navy is circling Taiwan. Jets are circling Taiwan. Warships have been deployed into the bay. So this is, this is obviously a reaction to Takaichi, the Prime Minister of Japan, having made this statement a couple of weeks ago that if there would be a military solution in Taiwan around unification of China, then that would be regarded as a life-threatening existential problem for Japan. And so here recently, going back into some history, which is really quite relevant to the problem, some people in the scenario mongering are saying is that Taiwan is the new Ukraine for China. As Ukraine is for Russia, Taiwan is going to supposedly be the new Ukraine for China. Now, obviously, from a military standpoint, that I've talked about many times in the past, given the geographical location of Taiwan, several thousand miles away from us, practically being part of China, logistically, it gives China a tremendous advantage in a conventional war. I suppose for every ship of Marines we sent to Taiwan, the Chinese right across the bay would be putting in a dozen ships. The U.S. could never fight a conventional war with China in Taiwan. And as Daniel Ellsberg has said many times in 1958, and then again shortly before he died, that the Pentagon should reveal the discussion inside the Pentagon about the possible use of nuclear weapons in such a crisis between Taiwan and China. Now, I'm certainly not saying that that's on the current agenda, but the Damocles sword of any military provocation goes into an escalation anytime the United States would be confronted with a loss in conventional war terms. And that sword remains. It's the same thing. The crazy idea of putting American soldiers into the Ukraine, where the Russians have the ability to raise their army presence in the Ukraine by another 1 million soldiers in a very short period of time. How in the world would we ever do the same thing? Thousands of miles away. And the same thing goes for Israel. And you know, the placing of U.S. Army, Marines in the Middle East, greatly outnumbered. How insane can you get? But as Lavrov has come out and said, Moscow regards Taiwan as an inseparable part of China, which is our stated foreign policy for decades now. There's one China. And so in case of an escalation in the Taiwan Strait, Russia will support China according to the basic agreement that goes back to July 2001 between those two countries, which would be an intervention into the interrelations of the People's Republic. And China has all the reasons to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its own country, of which they believe Taiwan to be a part. So that gives you a sense that even if the Ukraine gets settled, the Ukraine issue, peace is established, demilitarization takes place, we're still not out of the danger zone. And I think that should really play up and use a lot as absolutely unacceptable. The article, which was first published in 2024 in Foreign Affairs, I mentioned it yesterday, where one of the executive editors basically says people should reread that because total war is back as of last year. And the editor, whose name is escaping me in a minute, it's a hyphenated name, sent that email out to all of the subscribers of Foreign Affairs, which is the written publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the evil stepsister of Chatham House. And he said that there are signs everywhere that countries are preparing for an all-out conflict. And you can see that preparation for an all-out war is happening in several parts of the world, not the least of them Europe, the European Union, the government, the German government, France, Great Britain, all in a rearmament program right now, which is absolutely destructive for their real economy. And it's going full speed at the expense of many of their social programs, especially the National Health Service in England. So in any case, Beijing has said that the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan is regarded as a dangerous act which infringes on China's sovereignty. Now, I'm always impressed by the gentleness of these news releases. China says to the U.S., hey, you always said there's a one China policy. What are you doing? Because this multi-billion-dollar military aid that you're giving to Taiwan is infringing on our sovereignty. Just as much as if China, well, that wouldn't happen. But if the European Union were to give multi-billion euro military support to Mexico to line the Mexican border along the Rio Grande with tanks, anti-aircraft missiles, defense systems, attack missiles, medium-range missiles, all along the Rio Grande, aimed northward, would we consider that infringing on our sovereignty? So Beijing tried to remind Washington as late as yesterday to abide by the one China principle and immediately stop arming Taiwan. Now, if China was as militarily aggressive a nation as the United States is, they probably would already have subdued Taiwan. But the businesses and the industries in Taiwan make a lot of money. And the Chinese, at their core, in their heart, are Confucianist thinking people that want peace, prosperity, and just to do business in a peaceful climate. Which is why when they took back Hong Kong from the United Kingdom, they kept the business of Hong Kong doing what it does because they want to do business. How much has life changed in Hong Kong? Not much at all. That's what they want to do with Taiwan. They don't want to attack Taiwan. They don't want to bomb Taiwan. Interestingly enough, in the Taiwan government, the majority of those in government right now want a hand-to-hand relationship with China, much as what Hong Kong has with China. Most of the elected officials in the Taiwanese government are very pro-one China policy. And they're smart enough to know that if push comes to shove, and China has to pull out the military guns against the presence of American support for Taiwan, Taiwan will be left a smoldering ash. So basically, the one China policy is international law since way back at the Cairo Conference and the Potsdam Declaration. And it has been reiterated many times in the following decades. So all of a sudden, to talk about Taiwanese independence is clearly what it is, a geopolitical provocation with the idea of the containment and potential defeat of China, which is completely unrealistic. I mean, that train left the station a long time ago. Liu Penghu, who's the speaker of the Chinese embassy in the United States, said that the Taiwanese question is for Beijing, not Taiwan or the United States, and that a red line is established with this, which Washington cannot cross. Now, that's just recently from Penghu, the Chinese ambassador to Washington, D.C. Now, the U.S. will never be able to contain China and instrumentalize Taiwan for its own use. The Pentagon just approved the biggest package ever, $11.1 billion, which includes missiles, as I said, artillery systems, tank defense systems, drones, various other military means. So the Chinese are reacting extremely sensitively about that. Now, apart from these military developments as such and diplomacy around it, there's this absolute visible tendency that the so-called democracies of this planet, which have always blown themselves up as the good ones, because they have the rules-based order, and the autocracies are dictatorships which don't allow free speech. Well, the reality of it is a little bit different, because you now see on both sides of the Atlantic an absolutely unbelievable attempt to repress dissidents, repress the political opposition of various kinds by the dictatorial means that are showing up. And now the worst, and I got to say which one is the worst here, the EU sanctions list. The European Union has put out a list of people that they have sanctioned, which includes 59 citizens so far. 59 citizens of the European Union. And it's going massively in the direction of dictatorship because they're sanctioning their own citizens. Several journalists, German journalists, are in exile, not allowed to ever return to Germany. Another one is practically blocked, sitting in Berlin. And then you have Jacques Bod, that I talked about yesterday, sitting in Brussels. He can't go home to his home country of Switzerland because he's not allowed to travel inside the European Union, meaning from Belgium, he can't go to Switzerland. And you know, it's actually a rather incredible thing, because the only argument the EU is using against Bod, Jacques Bod, a former member of Switzerland's security, is that supposedly he claimed that the Ukraine caused their own invasion in order to become a NATO member. Now, that's not completely accurate, because all Bod said is, and he quoted the former advisor to Zelensky, Arestovich, from 2019, which he quoted once. And the EU pretended that Bod would have said that himself, which he never did. He just quoted Arestovich. And what Arestovich said was the probability that our price, Ukraine's price, for a NATO membership is a big war with Russia. And the probability for that is 99.9%, which is rather identical with 100%. So that is not even factually accurate. And as I've talked about before, those who are regarded as absolutely objective, or either rather conservative military analysts who had high positions in the Swiss army and always use only Western sources and consciously don't use Russian sources. So there is this blocking of certain European citizens from moving around inside the European Union by dictate, because they said something positive about Russia. Positive in the sense that the war was not unprovoked, that Russia came to the aid of their own ethnic tribe being bombed on a regular basis from Kyiv in the Donbass. Since 2014. I talked to a fellow yesterday who is the husband of the lady I was taking care of. And he's involved in healthcare statistics to a great degree. And he served an LDS mission to the Ukraine, is fluent in Russian, talked about Odessa, talked about how beautiful Odessa is. Odessa is primarily Russian, even though it's in the Ukraine. But Odessa is surrounded by Russian forces right now. It probably won't be too long before they take it over. There is great historical value to Odessa in the sense of art and architecture. And I can understand why Putin will not send drones into the Odessa area unless they're 100% military targets. But this fellow yesterday made some interesting comments about healthcare. He said, and this is a little aside, I'm not going out in the weeds, I just need to mention this so I don't forget it. He said 40% of all monies spent in healthcare today is absolutely wasted. Wasted on bureaucratic design, bureaucratic dictates, HMOs, insurance problems, hospital administration problems. 40 cents of every dollar, he says, is absolutely wasted. Well, how much money do we spend in the military? How much of it is wasted? And now, with the absence of free speech and free assembly that is taking place in the European Union, and the worst of all is the nation of England. It's not a part of the European Union anymore, but still, you can be imprisoned. You can be arrested and imprisoned for up to 7 to 8 years for saying something critical about Israel regarding the genocide in Palestine. Now, there's also the blocking of certain European citizens from coming to our country. And this has now been defended by Sarah Rogers, the Undersecretary of State in the State Department. She said that the extraterritorial censorship of Americans is undermining free speech and innovation. This sanction had hit 5 people, among them British citizens and some Germans and a Frenchman. And Marco Rubio said the sanctions were there because of organized efforts against American platforms to force these American platforms to punish American viewpoints. What are the details? The details are any criticism of Israel, any criticism of Ukraine having started the Ukraine war. Criticism in the sense, not against that, but promoting the idea that the Russians definitely were unprovoked in their invasion of the Ukraine. Sarah Rogers, again Undersecretary of the State Department, said the aim is to protect freedom of speech and the competitiveness of the U.S. technology sector. So you have this analogy in the UK where there is a complete crackdown on protests and protesters against the Gaza genocide. And now there's hunger strikes of people who have been called terrorists because they are having some civil actions like a break-in at the British branch of the Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit Systems and an infiltration of a Royal Air Force base to damage 2 planes with red paint and crowbars. There is a growing hunger strike going on. The British are completely slamming down on any pro-Palestine protests. And now it's almost like all the people sitting in glass houses on both sides of the Atlantic accusing each other of violating free speech by doing exactly the same thing. And I think that's definitely something to be watched very carefully because it really is a threat to democracy, as democracy is becoming more and more a hollow word. And now the immediacy of the danger can't be underplayed, because in 2022, not only is the New START treaty, and with that the last strategic arms control agreement potentially going out, Putin has offered to prolong it for 1 year if the U.S. will do so. But so far from the U.S., there's no response. So that goes into effect potentially in February. And when the U.S. long-range missiles are supposed to be installed in Germany is an open question. The exact time date is not yet clear, but there is basically no indication yet that Trump has exited from this agreement, which was made between Biden and Scholz, if you can call that an agreement, back in 2024. So it has to be assumed that the stationing of long-range missile systems in Germany will take place. Long-range missile systems in Germany, not the Ukraine. This would feature the Typhoon missile system with a range of up to 2,000 kilometers, which could threaten strikes deep in Russia, including Moscow. Now, the defense minister, German Defense Minister Pistorius, had signed the order for the Typhoons during his July trip this year to the United States. And he was saying that this system would bridge the 7-year gap expected, which will be the time the Europeans need to develop a genuine European missile capability. So for that, a project has been put into motion called the European Long-Range Strike Approach, or ELSA, which has been signed initially by Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and joined in the meantime by Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. What does that mean? Well, it could mean that you have right now missiles which could have a range of 2,000 kilometers into Russia, nuclear capable. So that is why the Russians have said that once these systems are installed, it would make Germany a prime target for a first strike. Now, I think that's exactly the same thing as the medium-range missile crisis at the beginning of the 80s with Reagan, where you had hundreds of thousands of people back then in the streets being absolutely aware that this meant the world was on the edge of World War III, which was stated many times by Helmut Schmidt, Chancellor of Germany, among others. And while the danger in a much more advanced strategic situation is much higher, but no hundreds of thousands are in the street now. Where's the demonstrator? Well, the demonstrators have to be very careful what they're demonstrating against, because they can be picked up without habeas corpus and thrown in jail, the way we've done to many foreign citizens at Guantanamo with no rights. Just pick them up and send them off. So that makes absolutely clear why we have to pay the closest of attention to what is going on here, because you, as a citizen of this country, you're being monitored. Facial recognition is picking you up all over the place. I don't think you can go to a local mall without facial recognition scanning you. If you use a credit card, they know where you're spending your money. They know what your monthly debits are to the various organizations that you subscribe, your movie channels, and other organizations that you might be donating money to. What kind of food you buy, what kind of a car you drive, where you live, all going into these massive databases. And now they want to build one of the largest ones on the planet down around Delta. They need a lot of water to do that. Seems kind of crazy to do that in the desert. But nonetheless, Utah's being picked as a center for massive data acquisition and analysis. And now AI comes into it. And the security architecture that countries are putting together or redesigning, especially in our country, is how are they going to control the use of AI, not only in the military, where it's already being used, as we have seen in Gaza by the IDF targeting Palestinians, but also in use by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it's providing wrong data, as it turns out, for the attack against Iran in June of this year. Now, there are some extremely legitimate concerns by the experts of AI that this self-optimization process of some of these symptoms could easily get out of control. Now, when I hear stuff like that, I always wonder, were they talking about becoming self-aware? There's an absolute need, urgent need, to find an agreement between the United States and China, who are both the world leaders in the development of these AI systems, whose agreement would be the precondition for lesser countries to be a part of it. I mean, lesser countries in terms of their capabilities to join the AI field. But it just shows you that not only nuclear weapons that are, as dangerous a threat to humanity that is, but there's a lot of other threats to humanity which can only be contained through such an agreement for a new security and development architecture between the United States and China that includes restrictions with AI development. Now, there's not going to be restrictions with AI development. These things are going to go on behind the scenes anyway. Now, another thing, Netanyahu's visit with Trump yesterday. I think, or is it today? I'm not sure. Anyway, it remains to be seen. The question is the mood in the American population against further military aid to Israel dominant, as it seems to be in the polls, less and less support on the part of the United States for the genocide? Or will Netanyahu succeed to some degree, or did he succeed, with some kind of an agreement with Trump to launch more devastation in Gaza, more devastation in Lebanon, and getting ready for the coming war with Iran? Now, I had predicted as early as last summer, after the June attack on Iran, that there would be a much bigger one coming before the end of the year. Well, the end of the year is tomorrow midnight. So I was off a little bit on that. But we'll see as the day goes by. Now, there are some positive signs. And it's very clearly seen by the fact that Turkey, which has been devastated in an earthquake back 2 years ago, 2023, they have built 455,000 new housing units in 11 provinces of Turkey. And this is a major sign of going in the right direction. It shows what the benefit is if you go into an area of construction, bringing in help from other countries, rather than the 360 billion euros, which according to the Kiel International Royal Institute has been spent on Ukrainian armaments since February of 2022. 360 billion. So while Turkey has made tremendous improvement in recovering from that massive earthquake, for the billions that it has cost to do this, essentially that same amount of money has been spent on the Ukraine so far, 360 billion euros. American dollars being in there, of course. How much of that went to payoffs, graft? How much of that went to buy American military implements only to turn around and sell them on the international war market? And all the stories. I've heard them. I've talked about them on my radio show. How much of that money actually went to the Ukrainian battlefield, as opposed to the pockets of the criminal aspect? 360 billion euros. Just imagine how many schools, how many bridges could have been built if that money would have been used for productive purposes. And now the method of building infrastructure, helping countries out of poverty, while that's clearly the superior model compared to trying to control the world by military means. And that's why China, without any question, has already won the race in terms of influence around this planet, which is why this whole thing with Venezuela is taking place. And the Chancay port on the other side of South America and Peru, built by China to become the largest seaport in the Western Hemisphere. and the beginning of the building of high-speed rail systems from the Chancay port through the Alps over to Brazil and Colombia and Argentina and Venezuela. And the Chinese are excelling at this. The latest example of their technological breakthroughs that was just recently announced is that they have set a new maglev world record by being able to accelerate in 2 seconds to 700 kilometers per hour. If my math is correct, that's 460 some miles an hour. In 2 seconds. Now, that's just unbelievable. Now, I have an electric car. I have a Tesla. It's the slower of the models that came out in 2018. But it is so stinking fast that from a dead stop, because they are electric motors that have immediate torque, you don't have to build up the 3,500 RPMs to get full torque. It'll pin you in your seat if I slam the accelerator down to the floor. It'll just throw you backwards and pin you in your seat. I don't do that anymore. I want to preserve the life of my car. But that's just 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. In 2 seconds, this maglev train was doing 460 something miles an hour. Now, the G-forces that are generated with that kind of acceleration would make it impossible for any living life form to be in the presence, because it would squash you down to the thickness of a hamburger. But in a short-term interval, they got to 700 kilometers. And one of the specific features of the maglev technology is that in its acceleration, it has absolutely negligent pullback or blowback effect. So unlike normal acceleration, where you are pressed against whatever background, just fantastic technology. Can you get to a point where you could transport goods at 700 kilometers per hour on a maglev train? That's where the train is elevated above the track in an electric field. The Chinese have been developing this for a long time, and now they finally tested it. 700 kilometers in 2 seconds. What are we doing? Well, I could say a lot more. I just want to conclude this part of the show. Oh my goodness, we're almost out of time. With a very important announcement. There's going to be a meeting of Diane Sayre on January 10th in New York with an in-person event of 200 people in a Zoom conference where they're trying to get 500 people registered. It will not be live streamed for obvious reasons, but there will be an in-person event where several people will be participating. People like Colonel McGregor, William Happer, Scott Ritter, Stephen Starr. And it will be an important announcement pertaining to the general situation of the United States in the year of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and what has to happen to uphold that position of America. You can get more information by going to the Schiller Institute and looking into that. So obviously there is a press release trying to get all friendly media, friendly alternative media, bloggers, podcasters, other people to register for that meeting and to report about it. And I'm thinking that being a podcaster and a radio announcer, I should be doing something myself with that. That's just on January 10th. Because obviously the situation is what we need right now, are voices of reason. And whatever happens inside our country, will be one of the absolute decisive factors because obviously the world is hanging on the verge of financial disintegration. And if you look at events around the European banking system, which is potentially blowing up the entire financial system of Switzerland, it's just a microcosm of what the situation in the whole world is at large. So I think that's probably the update for this week between yesterday and today. I just might end it at that point. I'm supposed to have another 10 minutes. But, there's one more thing I wanted to mention. In this high stakes act of strategic desperation, Britain's client state, the Ukraine, launched this mass drone attack on just the other night on Russian President Vladimir Putin's residence near Valdai, following on or possibly even overlapping the meeting between Zelensky and President Trump at Mar-a-Lago yesterday. And to understand the enormity of this, you consider what would happen if some nation had launched a drone attack on Camp David. Now, I know the presidents like to run off to Camp David on a regular basis. I don't think anybody used it as much as George Bush Jr. did. But suppose that happened. They didn't launch a drone attack on the White House. Because if you notice the roof of the White House lately, I don't think you could get a drone past the fence that surrounds the White House without being shot to pieces by anti-drone military means. But Camp David is out there in the forest in Maryland. And just suppose there was a drone attack on Camp David while the president's family, military people, whatever he was meeting with, were present. So Zelensky immediately issued a disclaimer denying responsibility for the attack. He launched a campaign demanding that the United States and Europe take action against Russia because it claimed Russia was going to hit the Ukraine in response. Well, it did. And responsibility for such rashness lies with Great Britain and its European and the U.S. co-thinkers who cannot tolerate a lasting settlement to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I mean, their entire strategy is now pivoted around driving Europe into war against Russia. And should the United States and Russia work out terms to end NATO's Ukraine war against Russia, the entire British political, military, economy strategy would collapse. And this latest desperado action probably is going to backfire badly. However, given President Trump's angry response, holding the Ukraine responsible for this attack on Trump's residence. So yesterday, the Russian Foreign Defense Minister, Lavrov, issued a statement on the attack and Russia's response. He said, on the night of December 28-29, the Kyiv regime launched a terrorist attack using 91 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles on the state residence of the President of the Russian Federation in the Novgorod region. All the UAVs were destroyed by the air defense systems of the Russian armed forces, with no casualties or damage from drone debris, he reported. And then he emphasized this. This is Lavrov. Notably, the attack was carried out during the intensive talks to settle the Ukrainian conflict between Russia and the U.S. Such reckless actions will not go unanswered. Despite this attack, we have no intention to withdraw from the negotiations with the United States. However, given the utmost degeneration of the criminal Kyiv regime, which has shifted to a policy of state terrorism, Russia's negotiating position will be reviewed. What does that mean? The possibility that they might back down from some of the things they were willing to grant the Ukraine? Well, he didn't elaborate. And then Zelensky spent the day denying that his military services would ever do such a thing. He said President Trump, his team, and the Europeans should intervene and do the necessary work with these people, the Russians, who just yesterday said that they truly want to end this war. Zelensky then got on the phone with at least 3 NATO members, heads of state, to get them to agree to do what the necessary work against Russia. I think it's critical that the world doesn't stay silent at this point. Zelensky says we can't allow Russia to undermine the work on achieving a lasting peace, after they just tried to take out Putin at his residence in Valdai. All right. There's more, but we're out of time. I'm going to go ahead and end the program. Lowell will be with you here shortly. I'm going to go back to playing what was on there before. I'm going to stop the recording. Bink. And I will put what was on there before. Or at least I'm going to try to. And then I will be back tomorrow for 2 hours starting at 7 a.m. With a program on health. A lot of things relevant to this time of year that I think you will find interesting and worth your listenership. So those of you on the stream, thank you so much for continuing to be a part of the program. I really appreciate your listenership.